So there's a specific box that sits inside the royal archives at Windsor. And until earlier this year, almost nobody outside a very small circle of household staff and archivists knew what was actually inside it. Not William, not Charles, not even most of the private secretaries who've worked in that building for the past 2 decades. It wasn't hidden because it was scandalous, exactly. It was hidden because Queen Elizabeth II specifically instructed that it stay sealed until a particular condition was met. And that condition, as it turns out, had nothing to do with dates or anniversaries. It had to do with succession itself. And when that box was finally opened this year, what came out of it didn't just surprise the people in the room. It fundamentally changed what Prince William is set to inherit in a way that Charles, the actual king, the man currently sitting on the throne, had no idea was coming. And by every account since, it left him stunned in a way that people close to him say they haven't seen before. So let's talk about what was actually in that box, why Elizabeth sealed it in the first place, and why the timing of its opening might be the most quietly devastating part of this entire story for Charles. Here's the thing you need to understand about how the late Queen operated in her final years. She wasn't just managing the day-to-day business of the monarchy. She was thinking, very deliberately, about what the institution would look like decades after she was gone, long past Charles's reign, into William's, and even beyond that. And one of the tools she used to manage that long view was something the royal household refers to, informally, as a conditional instruction. It's not a will. It's not a formal decree. It's a private letter held by the keeper of the royal archives that only gets opened when a specific, predetermined circumstance occurs. Sometimes that circumstance is a date. Sometimes it's an event. In this case, according to people with knowledge of the archive's internal procedures, the condition Elizabeth set was tied directly to William formally taking on expanded stewardship of the Duchy of Cornwall's historic holdings, something that happened quietly, administratively earlier this year, as part of the broader transition of responsibilities that's been underway since Charles's health situation became public. The moment that transition was finalized on paper, the condition was met, and the box came out. Now, before I tell you what was inside it, I want to walk you through why Elizabeth would even set something up this way, because I think it tells you something important about how she saw her own family and, honestly, how little she may have trusted her own son to handle certain decisions while she was still alive to influence them directly. Elizabeth spent 70 years on the throne. 70 years watching institutions, watching property, watching titles move between generations, sometimes cleanly, sometimes in ways that caused real damage to the family's public standing. And by the time she reached her final decade, she'd developed a very specific philosophy about how to protect the things she cared about most. She didn't just make decisions. She made decisions that would activate themselves automatically at a future point she chose. Regardless of who was sitting on the throne when that point arrived, it was a way of exercising control from beyond her own reign, not through some dramatic public decree, but through a kind of quiet, bureaucratic patience that almost nobody would notice until it mattered. And what was inside that particular sealed instruction was a reallocation. Not of money, not exactly, and not of a title in the traditional sense. It was a reallocation of a specific set of properties and associated rights within the duchy portfolio, holdings that, under the assumptions everyone had operated under for decades, were supposed to remain bundled together with the rest of the duchy's general estate, to be managed however the reigning monarch or the Duke of Cornwall of the moment saw fit. Elizabeth's instruction detached a portion of that from the general pool entirely, and I mean that literally. She carved out specific holdings, some of them dating back generations, tied to land and associated income streams that had quietly grown in value over the decades, and she redirected them into a separate structure that bypasses the normal chain of discretionary control. Instead of these holdings being something Charles, as king, could manage, adjust, or redirect however he saw fit during his reign, Elizabeth's instruction locks them specifically to William, and specifically to William's direct line. meaning George eventually, and the generations after him, in a way that Charles cannot unwind, cannot renegotiate, and cannot redirect even if he wanted to. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Charles is king. In almost every practical sense, when it comes to the institution's internal property and finances, the king's word tends to carry enormous weight. But this specific set of holdings, carved out by his own mother, sealed away for years, released only once a very particular administrative trigger was pulled, sits completely outside his discretion. He doesn't get a say. He never did. He just didn't know it until the letter was opened. Now, here's where it gets properly interesting, because the reason this landed the way it did isn't just about property. It's about what those specific holdings actually represent within the family's internal understanding of legacy. According to people familiar with the duchy's historic records, a portion of what Elizabeth redirected traces back to land originally associated with the duchy during the mid-20th century, specifically holdings that were expanded and improved during the period when Elizabeth's own father, King George VI, held the title of Duke of Cornwall himself before his accession. In other words, this wasn't some random slice of the estate. It was land tied to Elizabeth's own father, land that had passed through the duchy structure for decades, and land that Elizabeth apparently felt strongly enough about to make sure it skipped an entire generation of discretionary control. She skipped Charles, deliberately, structurally, in writing. And when William's office received formal notification of what the newly unsealed instruction actually contained, the first call wasn't to celebrate. It was to figure out how to tell the king. Because here's the situation this created. William didn't ask for this. He didn't lobby for it. And by all accounts, he had no idea the instruction even existed until the keeper of the archives initiated the formal release process earlier this year. This wasn't a case of the ambitious heir maneuvering around his father. This was Elizabeth, years ago, quietly deciding on her own that a piece of the family's inheritance would move directly from her generation to William's, without passing through Charles's hands at all. And when the news reached Charles, when he was informed through the appropriate channels that a portion of duchy holdings tied to his own father's legacy had been redirected around him, on his own mother's explicit written instruction, activated by a bureaucratic trigger nobody had told him to watch for. People close to him have described his reaction as something closer to disbelief than anger. Not disbelief that William would receive it eventually. Disbelief that his mother had specifically structured things so that he, as king, would never have had the chance to make that decision himself. Let's sit with that for a second, because I think it's easy to rush past how strange this actually is. Charles is not just any member of the family experiencing a surprising inheritance. He is the reigning monarch. He has, in theory, more institutional authority over the crown's holdings than literally anyone else alive. And yet, on this specific matter, involving property tied to his own father's history, he had zero input, zero warning, and zero ability to change the outcome, because his mother had already made the decision, sealed it away, and set it up to trigger itself long after she'd be around to explain her reasoning. So the obvious question is, why did she do it that way? Why not just tell Charles directly while she was alive and let him make peace with it? And the answer, as it's been pieced together by people who worked closely with the Queen in her final years, seems to come down to something fairly specific about how Elizabeth viewed Charles's relationship with property and inheritance more broadly. She had apparently watched him for decades make decisions about estates, about patronages, about what stays in the family and what gets restructured, and she had specific concerns, never stated publicly, obviously, but described by multiple people who worked in her household, about whether certain holdings would remain intact and protected if left entirely to Charles's discretion during his reign. Not because she doubted his love for the institution, but because she'd watched him, over the years, show a consistent willingness to modernize, to restructure, to adjust things according to his own priorities. Highgrove, the environmental initiatives, the way he's reshaped parts of the Duchy of Cornwall's operations to reflect his own interests. All of that is admirable in its own way, but it also, apparently, made Elizabeth nervous about leaving certain specific, historically significant holdings entirely subject to that same instinct for change. So she took a piece of it off the table, permanently, before he ever got the chance to touch it. Now, I want to be clear about something, because this is the part that I think actually matters most if you're trying to understand the bigger picture here. This isn't really a story about William getting richer or about Charles losing something in a purely financial sense. The properties and income streams involved, while meaningful, aren't the central point. The central point is what this reveals about how deliberately Elizabeth was working to constrain and shape decisions that would only become relevant after her death. Decisions about her own son's reign, decisions about what he would and wouldn't control, made in advance, without his knowledge, and executed by people who'd been quietly waiting for the right administrative trigger for years. Because once you understand that this specific holding was structured this way, you start to wonder what else might be sitting in that archive, sealed, waiting for its own condition to be met. And the honest answer, from what people inside the household have suggested, is probably more than anyone currently knows. Elizabeth reportedly left several conditional instructions during her final years, and this duchy reallocation is simply the first one whose trigger condition happened to be met first. Nobody, including Charles, apparently has a full list of what else is sitting in there, or what circumstances might unlock the next one. And that uncertainty, more than the specific holdings themselves, seems to be what's actually eating at Charles right now. Because think about what it means to be king, and to know that your own mother left behind a series of decisions that are going to keep surfacing throughout your reign, each one potentially redirecting some piece of the institution away from your control, and you have no way of knowing when the next one is coming, or what it's going to say, or who it's going to benefit. That's not a single moment of surprise. That's an ongoing condition. Every administrative milestone William reaches, every formal transition of responsibility that gets finalized on paper, could potentially be the trigger for the next sealed instruction to release. Charles isn't just dealing with one piece of unexpected news. He's dealing with the knowledge that his mother built a system specifically designed to keep making decisions on her behalf, long after she's gone, entirely outside his ability to anticipate or influence them. And here's a detail that I think really sharpens how personal this feels for Charles. Because it's not just about institutional control. It's about the specific choice to root this particular set of holdings through William rather than through Charles's own household first, even temporarily. Elizabeth could have structured this differently. She could have had the instructions specify that, upon her death, or upon Charles's accession, the holdings passed to him with an obligation to eventually transfer them to William at some future point. That would have preserved the outcome. William eventually gets them, while still giving Charles the dignity of being the one who formally hands them down, the way monarchs traditionally do with their heirs. She didn't do that. She skipped him entirely. And the people who worked closely with her suggest that wasn't an oversight. It was the point. She wanted William to receive this specific piece of the family's history directly from her, structurally speaking, without it ever being something Charles held, managed, or had the option to alter, even briefly, even symbolically. For a man who has waited the better part of 70 years to become king, who spent decades as the longest-serving heir apparent in British history, watching his mother make decision after decision while he stood, quite literally, next in lines in, to now discover that even after finally reaching the throne, there are specific pieces of the institution his own mother deliberately arranged to keep out of his hands entirely, permanently, structurally. That's a very particular kind of sting. It's not about the money. It's about what it says regarding how much Elizabeth actually trusted him with the full weight of what he'd inherited. Now, William's side of this has been notably quiet, and I think that quietness is itself worth paying attention to. He hasn't made any public statement, hasn't acknowledged the reallocation in any official capacity beyond what was legally required to process it. And people close to him suggest that's deliberate, that he understands exactly how sensitive this is for his father, and that drawing any attention to it, celebrating it in any way, would only make an already difficult situation worse. Whatever William privately thinks about receiving this instruction, about what it says regarding his grandmother's confidence in him specifically, as opposed to his father, he's kept entirely to himself. But here's the thing about institutional shifts like this one. They don't need public statements to matter. The holdings have already been reallocated. The legal structure is already in place. Whatever Charles thinks about it, whatever he might have wanted to happen differently, none of that changes the outcome, because his mother made sure, years in advance, that his opinion on this particular matter would never actually be required. And if you zoom out from the specific property details, I think what you're really looking at here is a preview of something much larger. Because Elizabeth didn't just make one decision about one set of holdings. She built an entire system of deferred authority, designed to keep exerting her influence over the institution's future for years, possibly decades, after her death. A system that appears to bypass Charles's reign almost entirely in certain specific, carefully chosen respects, in favor of directing things straight toward William instead. Which raises a question that people inside the household are apparently only just beginning to grapple with. If Elizabeth was willing to structure this level of long-term control around duchy property, what else did she put in place? What other conditional instructions are sitting in that archive, waiting for their trigger? And how many more moments like this one is Charles going to have to face, being informed after the fact that a decision affecting his own reign was already made for him years ago by a mother who apparently wanted the final say over more of the institution's future than anyone currently realized? Because right now, based on everything that surfaced, since this specific instruction was unsealed, the honest answer seems to be nobody actually knows. Not the courtiers, not the archivists, possibly not even Charles himself. The only person who knew the full scope of what she'd set in motion was Elizabeth, and she took that knowledge with her. What we do know is this: the first sealed instruction has already changed what William stands to inherit, has already demonstrated that Charles' authority as king has real, concrete limits that were set before he ever took the throne, and has already established a pattern that everyone around this family is now watching closely, waiting to see when, not if, the next one surfaces. And when it does, based on everything we've just walked through, there's no particular reason to think Charles will get any more warning than he did this time.